At 63, she had $17, nowhere to go, and no one left, until a stranger asked one impossible question. The stagecoach left her standing in a cloud of dust on the main street of Copper Valley, Arizona Territory, with nothing but a worn carpet bag and 63 years of living etched into every line on her face. Margaret Ellen Thornton watched the coach disappear around the bend, taking with it the last connection to everything she had known. The telegram had arrived 3 weeks ago, informing her that her sister had passed. The sister she had been traveling to live with. The sister who had been her final hope. Margaret stood there, feeling the hot wind pull at her gray hair, wondering what a woman her age was supposed to do when the world had taken everything from her. Her husband Samuel had died 2 winters past from a fever that swept through their small farm in Missouri. Her only son had been killed in a mining accident in Colorado before that. The farm had been sold to pay debts she never knew Samuel had accumulated, and now her sister Ruth was gone before Margaret could even reach her. She had $17 to her name and nowhere on God's earth to go. The town around her moved with its daily rhythm. Men on horseback rode past. Women in bonnets crossed the dusty street. Children chased a spotted dog between the buildings. Life continued as if her heart were not breaking right there on that wooden sidewalk. Margaret picked up her carpet bag and began to walk. She did not know where she was walking to, but she could not stand still any longer. Standing still felt too much like giving up, and she had promised herself long ago that she would never do that. She passed the mercantile, the land office, the hotel she could not afford. Her feet carried her to the edge of town, past the last row of buildings where the road stretched out toward the distant mountains. The sun was beginning its descent, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that would have taken her breath away if she had any breath left to spare. There was a watering trough near the livery stable, and she sat down on its edge, not caring if it was proper or not. Propriety seemed a luxury for women who had homes to return to. She sat there for a long time, watching the sky change colors, feeling the ache in her bones from the long journey, trying to remember the last time someone had spoken to her with kindness. That was when she saw him. He was riding in from the range, a tall man on a chestnut horse, his hat pushed back to reveal a weathered face and hair that had turned the color of iron. He moved in the saddle with the ease of someone who had spent a lifetime on horseback. There was a tiredness about him too, visible in the slope of his shoulders and the way he sat just slightly hunched forward. He was looking at her. Margaret straightened her back, some old instinct of pride surfacing despite everything. She folded her hands in her lap and pretended she was merely resting, that she had somewhere to be and people waiting for her. The man guided his horse toward the livery stable, dismounted, and handed the reins to a young boy who came running out. Then, instead of walking into town like any sensible person would do at supper time, he walked toward her. Margaret felt her heart beat faster, though whether from fear or something else, she could not say. She was too old to be afraid of men, she told herself. What could he take from her that had not already been taken? He stopped a respectful distance away, removing his hat to reveal more of that iron-gray hair. His eyes were blue, a pale blue like a winter sky, and there were deep lines around them from years of squinting into the sun. He was perhaps 5 or 6 years older than her, she guessed. Somewhere near 70. "Ma'am," he said, and his voice was low and rough, like gravel in a creek bed. "I don't mean to intrude." "You're not intruding," Margaret said, though she did not know why she said it. He turned his hat in his hands, a nervous gesture that seemed out of place on a man so clearly accustomed to hard living. "I saw you get off the stage this afternoon. I was up on the ridge, checking on some cattle, and I saw the whole thing. Saw you standing there after it left." Margaret felt heat rise to her cheeks, so someone had witnessed her moment of complete devastation. "I was merely collecting my thoughts. Yes, ma'am." He was quiet for a moment. "I also saw you walk through town. Saw you sit down here. That was near 3 hours ago. She had not realized so much time had passed. The sky was darker now, the first stars beginning to appear. She had been so lost in her own sorrow that the world had moved on without her noticing. "I have nowhere to go," she heard herself say. The words came out before she could stop them, raw and honest in a way she had not intended. She looked down at her worn hands, ashamed of her own weakness. The man was quiet for a long moment. When she finally looked up at him, there was something in his eyes that she recognized. It was the same thing she saw when she looked in the mirror. Loneliness. Deep, bone-aching loneliness that had settled in like winter and never left. "My name is Thomas Wilder," he said. "I've got a ranch about 7 miles north of here. Had it for 40 years now. Built every fence post with my own hands, raised cattle, broke horses." He paused, still turning that hat in his hands. "My wife Eleanor passed on 8 years ago. My son moved to California with his family and writes me maybe twice a year. I've got a foreman named Pete who lives in the bunkhouse and 3 hired hands who come and go with the seasons." Margaret did not know why he was telling her this, but she listened anyway. It had been so long since anyone had spoken to her from then the brief exchange of commerce. "I'm 69 years old," Thomas continued. "I wake up every morning before dawn because that's what I've always done. I work all day because there's always work to be done. And every evening I sit on my porch and watch the sun go down over the mountains, and there's no one to share it with." He stopped turning his hat and looked directly at her, those pale blue eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her heart skip. "Do you need a home and a husband?" he asked. The question hung in the air between them, impossible and wonderful and terrifying all at once. Margaret felt tears spring to her eyes for the first time since she had received the telegram about Ruth. "You don't know me," she whispered. "No, ma'am, I don't. But I know loneliness when I see it. I've been living with it long enough to recognize its face. And I know that life is shorter than we think it is when we're young, and that the years we have left are precious. And that spending them alone when you don't have to seems like a waste of whatever time God has given us." Margaret stood up from the watering trough, her legs unsteady. She was acutely aware of how she must look, dusty and travel-worn, an old woman with gray hair and wrinkled hands and nothing to offer anyone. "I was married for 41 years, she said, to a man named Samuel Thornton. He was not perfect, but he was mine and I loved him. He died 2 years ago. Before that I lost my son Jacob in a mining accident. He was only 28. I came here to live with my sister, but she passed before I arrived. I have $17, a carpet bag full of worn clothes, and not a soul in this world who would notice if I disappeared tomorrow." Thomas nodded slowly. "And we're the same, you and me. 2 people who've outlived everyone they loved, standing at the end of a road with nowhere to go." He took a step closer, and Margaret could see the genuine kindness in his face, the lack of any ulterior motive. He was simply a lonely man who had seen a lonely woman and recognized a chance to make both their lives less empty. "I'm not asking for love," he said gently. "I know that's not something you can decide on a street corner with a stranger. I'm asking for companionship, for someone to share meals with, for a voice in the house besides my own, for someone to sit with on the porch and watch the sunset." He paused. "If love comes, it would be a blessing I don't deserve, but if it doesn't, I'd still be grateful for the company." Margaret felt the tears slip down her cheeks. She had cried so rarely in her life, always believing that tears were a weakness she could not afford. But standing there in the growing darkness, being offered something she had never expected to find again, she could not hold them back. "I don't even know your middle name," she said, a small laugh escaping through her tears. "It's Edward, Thomas Edward Wilder. My mother named me after her father, Margaret Ellen Thornton. My mother named me after hers." He smiled then, and the smile transformed his weathered face into something almost handsome. "Well, Margaret Ellen Thornton, what do you say?" She looked at him for a long moment, this stranger who was offering her everything she had lost. A home, a partner, a reason to wake up in the morning. It was madness, she knew. Sensible women did not marry men they had just met on the street. But sensible women also did not find themselves alone and penniless at 63 with no one in the world to turn to. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Thomas Edward Wilder. I'll marry you." They were married 3 days later in the small church at the edge of Copper Valley with the minister's wife and Pete the foreman serving as witnesses. Margaret wore her best dress, the dark blue one she had saved for special occasions, and Thomas wore a suit that smelled of cedar from being stored so long. When the minister pronounced them man and wife, Thomas kissed her gently on the cheek, and Margaret felt something flutter in her chest that she had thought long dead. The first weeks were awkward, as first weeks must be between strangers trying to build a life together. They learned each other's habits and preferences. Thomas liked his coffee strong and his eggs fried hard. Margaret preferred to rise early and watch the dawn from the kitchen window. He gave her the bedroom that had been his and Eleanor's, and he slept in the small room off the parlour, telling her he would not presume anything she was not ready to give. Margaret found herself grateful for his consideration, but also, increasingly, aware of a warmth growing in her chest whenever he was near. She watched him work, marveling at the strength still in his arms despite his age. She listened to him tell stories about the ranch, about the early days when the territory was wild and dangerous, about Eleanor and the life they had built together. And slowly, carefully, she began to tell him her own stories, about Samuel and their little farm, about Jacob as a boy, always laughing, always running, about the dreams she had once had and the way life had slowly taken them from her. Thomas listened to everything. He never interrupted, never judged, never tried to fix what could not be fixed. He simply listened, and in his listening, Margaret felt herself beginning to heal. One evening, about 6 weeks after their wedding, they were sitting on the porch as they did every night, watching the sun paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. Margaret had her hands folded in her lap, and Thomas was in his rocking chair, his own hands resting on its worn arms. "Margaret," he said softly. She turned to look at him. "I need to tell you something." Her heart clenched. This was it, she thought. He had realized his mistake. He wanted her to leave. "These past weeks," Thomas continued, his eyes still on the sunset, "have been the happiest I've known in 8 years. Ma, why longer? You've brought something back to this house that I thought was gone forever." He finally looked at her, and his eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I think I'm falling in love with you, Margaret Ellen Wilder, and I know that might not be what you wanted from this arrangement. So, if it makes you uncomfortable, I'll keep it to myself from now on. But I needed you to know." Margaret felt her own tears begin to fall. She reached across the space between their chairs and took his hand. It was rough and calloused and warm, and it fit perfectly in hers. "Thomas," she said, "I never expected to love again. I thought that part of my life was over. But you have shown me such kindness, such patience, such genuine goodness, that I cannot help what I feel." She squeezed his hand. "I'm falling in love with you too." He stood up from his chair and pulled her gently to her feet. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other. Two people who had thought they were finished with love, discovering that love was not finished with them. Then he kissed her, properly this time. Not just a gentle brush on the cheek, but a real kiss, tender and sweet and full of promise. That night, Margaret moved her things from the big bedroom into the small room off the parlor, and Thomas moved his back where they belonged. And when they lay down together, it was not with the passion of youth, but with something deeper, a profound gratitude for second chances and the grace that had brought them together. The years that followed were not always easy. Thomas's health began to fail in his 75th year, and Margaret nursed him through a long winter of fever and weakness. But he recovered, stubborn as the land he had worked all his life, and they had 5 more years together after that. They celebrated small things, the way people do when they understand how precious time truly is. The first wildflowers of spring, the sound of rain on the roof, the simple pleasure of sharing a meal. Thomas died peacefully in his sleep on a spring morning when he was 80 years old, with Margaret beside him and his hand in hers. She grieved him deeply, as she had grieved Samuel and Jacob and Ruth. But this grief was different. This grief was mixed with gratitude for the years they had been given, for the love that had surprised them both, for the home she had found when she thought all homes were closed to her. She stayed on at the ranch, managing it with Pete's help, living in the house Thomas had built, watching the sunsets from the porch where they had sat together so many evenings, and sometimes, when the light was just right and the wind carried the scent of sage from the hills, she could almost feel him beside her, that tall, weathered man who had seen a lonely woman on a dusty street and asked her the question that changed both their lives.